Okay, hey guys. So I just finished working on my 2001 Miata, so that's an NB2. The issue I was having was a intermittent high idle at first is what I thought it was. So this situation is going to basically be you're driving, it's a 5-speed. If you go into neutral, dip the clutch in, the revs come right back down, but they hang at 1500 or around there, and they will not go down until I came to a complete stop, wait about 3 seconds, okay, it'll idle. Same thing if you're just sitting there and you rev it up past 2500, 2800, on its way down, you're going to notice it's going to stop at 1500 for a moment and then come down. I chased through a whole bunch of things. I could see after a bunch of testing, throttle body cleaning, be careful with that. There's a Teflon coating on the throttle body. Looking at the intake air control valve, whether that was dirty or not, I cleaned it. If you have 4scan and an OBD2 reader to plug into your computer on Windows, you can actually do an intake air test and reset. So I was able to do that. That wasn't the issue. When you looked at the actual data logger coming off from OBD2, I could actually see the car, the intake, all of that was working fine. The car was wanting to be revved at 1500. So then, okay, I couldn't figure out why. Some more testing. Anyway, the big point here, check your battery voltage. Once I did that, I threw my multimeter on, simple, cheap multimeter. I was at 8 volts. What actually tipped me off to this was on my 5th or 6th drive data logging, my blinker went out. And I was like, oh, come on, that too? And then it clicked for me. I went, well, wait a minute. Low voltage can cause all kinds of crazy issues with the car. Sure enough, I was at 8 volts. Okay, so now you got to check where we're at low voltage. Always you have to start with a good battery. So took the battery out. I gave it a charge up, and that seemed to do fine. It charged all the way to 12.5 volts. Took a few hours to do it. I did take it to get tested, and the guy at the auto parts store actually could not get the test done. He kept saying it would break and end out, and he was trying to sell me a battery, and I was like, well, just wait a minute, let me see. Because I found it interesting, right? I could start the car with the battery, and it could run with no alternator, or not being charged at least. I didn't know if the alternator was bad or what. And it would charge fully to 12.2 volts, so I didn't have a dead cell or something. Held on to that. So there's a whole bunch of testing you can do in the factory manual for the alternator and stuff, but a big thing to do first of all is just run the car. If you're not getting 13.5 to 14.5 volts, you're not charging. Okay, now there's a couple of reasons for that. First reason, the scary reason, your power control module, ECU, whatever you want to call it, is not working like it should be. That's an expensive problem to deal with and hopefully don't want to, but that's fairly unlikely. They're quite reliable ECUs, and the voltage regulation is actually also done in the ECU partially on these cars. So the next thing you can look at is, okay, the alternator's fried. There's a bunch of things inside the alternator happening with different windings, diodes. There is some internal regulation there. There's a lot of stuff that could cause that. Or thirdly, you could have bad connections. So you want to do those voltage drop tests, which is basically looking at the B plus or the bolted terminal on the alternator to the power terminal, to the battery positive in the trunk. You're going to need a long wire to test that, maybe get some jumper leads or whatever you need to do. You also want to check your ground, so the chassis ground of the alternator to actual ground. You shouldn't have any voltage drops there. Again, these things are fairly unlikely, but you do want to rule that out. An alternator is expensive. And then lastly, what I did, if you're in this boat and you really want to condemn the alternator 100%, I took the alternator out. You got to take off the power steering and AC belt too, just to get the alternator belt off completely. And I started the car from it. Make sure the car is completely cold when you do this, because you're not getting the water pump running. You don't want to overheat your motor. But you can run it for 30, 40 seconds. It's not going to hurt anything. And so I could run it. And then again, with the voltmeter, there's the battery term post, which has always got 12 volts for battery voltage. And then there's 2 wires going to the alternator. This car uses a DP style alternator, which is different from the SL sense and line types. So that's why people say, don't get the alternator tested. They can fry it. If the tech doesn't know that it's a DP type, they can absolutely fry it. They work differently. A brief description on the DP style used in the NB2 Miata is called drive and phase. So both those signals are actually going and coming from the ECU. One should be about battery voltage, and the one's actually going to be PWM, pulse width modulation. I'll break that down on the paper here in a little bit. But just know the PWM voltage is about 3 volts. If you're going to do any sort of testing on the bench, I don't really recommend it. But you should if you do like 2.8 volts, that should be effectively 100% duty cycle on the drive terminal. The phase terminal basically goes back to the ECU, and I think the idea of that is basically that it's monitoring the voltage coming out of the alternator directly rather than looking at the battery voltage to see if there's a discrepancy or something like that. One of those two then will also go and control the battery light, but that's really completely electronically controlled in these cars, so it's not like the NAs at all in that sense. Yeah, and then so basically, like I said, ECU could be the problem, connections could be the problem, or the alternator, or the battery. So if you once you rule those out, it's going to be, for me, it was my alternator. And I could tell because when I did start the car with no alternator hooked up and I probed the 2 pins, 1 pin had basically nothing on it, which is fine because it's not connected. The car is a bit confused. And the other pin had battery voltage, what it should be. And if you wait a moment or two, you should see in the dash that battery light come on. If that battery light does not come on with no alternator in there, odds are you got a connection problem or the dreaded ECU issues. Yeah, so I wasn't able to get a new alternator anymore. It was the original Hitachi I had after 23 some odd years, but unfortunately couldn't get a new one here in Canada. So I had to get a reman one. I went for a reman out of Montreal, Armature DNS 2000. They're supposedly decent quality, so I guess we'll see. But sure enough, putting that in, that completely fixed my problem. Everything's good. The battery is charging. And sure enough, the high idle symptoms went away. And the longer you go about with this high idle issue, basically, you're going to find out it's a battery problem one way or the other because the battery is draining and not charging. So for me, I realized when that blinker didn't work, I went, that's kind of weird. But if you kept driving, you're going to notice. So I was actually starting to extinguish spark even on the way back limping at home. If I tried to get into it at all, 4,000 RPM or anything, stutter and fall because it can't even produce the voltage to do that. And so things are going to start to fail. You'll notice, but I just thought I'd try and give you guys a bit of a heads up and a bit of a way to solve this. In terms of alternator work, it's really not that bad. Collection of basic sockets and hand tools. If you have it, a 14mm flex head wrench, super useful. You don't need it, but yeah, that's about it. Just want to share the experience with you guys and hopefully keep some of you on the road a little longer. Take care.